All right. It's 8 a.m. on the West Coast, so let's get started. Uh, Hi, everyone. Ryan Taylor. I'm currently the VP of Solutions Engineering for Transposit. Welcome to the fifth Resolve conference hosted by BigPanda. I have been given the honorary title of Godfather of Resolve because this whole conference series started with me. No, it started with us actually. So way back in May of 2019, I was working as the director of production ops at Hulu, and I'd met two big employees for lunch, and they said, "Hey, uh, where do you find new technology?" And I gave a bunch of long-winded answers, but in the end, mentioned that trade shows were generally someplace I would find new products, new technology, but they were always focused on sales and not discovery. And so I said, hey, I'd really love a conference that just allowed us all to get together and really network and learn from each other, whether it was event management, AI ops, IT ops, DevOps, SecOps, DevSecOps, whatever it was, just all the ops. So the Big Panda team actually took that idea, and in September of 2019, the first Resolve conference took place in Santa Monica. Wasn't called Resolve back then, and at that first event, there were about 35 people from across the US and Europe who got together and listened to a couple of keynote speeches. That was definitely the highlight of that first conference because I spoke, and I love to hear myself speak, evidently. But also, Jason Walker, who is now the Chief Customer Officer at Big Panda, had led the IT operations team for Blizzard then. And we both did a keynote, and it was perfect. It was, your stereotypical Southern California day, blue skies, warm wind, good food, and a lot of people willing to share their story. So, that first one was really cool. And we all walked away from that conference wanting more. We wanted more time to network, more time to build relationships, more time to hear how we're not the only ones working to make our companies better. And then COVID hit, and all of our worlds changed in a lot of different ways, and that includes this conference as well. But without missing a beat, Resolve moved to virtual. We didn't have those face-to-face moments. We'd still make connections, and we'd share best practices, along with new ways of working remotely. We'd also finally be recognized for just how much of an impact our actions have on keeping the economy flowing, and as we found out later, growing. From the beginning, this conference was created for us, for everyone involved with ops, and minus any vendor pitches or lengthy slide presentations. So I'm going to take a moment really quick, and I'd like to thank a couple of the companies and community members who are speaking today, several of which I would consider friends. 3 Free Tech, Advent International, Akamai, Amazon Web Services, BigPanda, my good friends over at BlackRock 3, Cardinal Health, Dell, eWeek, Forrester, Honeywell, Insight Partners, Incubator, Insurity, Lumen Technologies, Machinify, Northwell Health, Sony PlayStation, Hey Ben, StackState, Star CIO, TIAA, Translations.com, Transposit, my company, VisionWorks, VMware, Waste Management, Wells Fargo, and finally, Windward Consulting. Without your participation, this conference couldn't happen. So, want to take you back. Here's a quick throwback from the first conference in 2019, how much Resolve has grown from 35 people. Oh, did I go too fast? Sorry. From 35 people to now over 1,000. And that is me speaking in Santa Monica in a very small room, which leads me all to thank all of you who are attending today for sharing your stories and helping make our industry better for our companies and the community. Please spread the word about Resolve through your organization. This conference only gets better when people attend, and the more people that participate, the better that is for all of us. And finally, the organizers would love to hear from you if you're interested in speaking at Resolve 2023. If you're interested, you can just send an email to resolve@bigpanda.io. And without further delay, and probably faster than we expected to, let me introduce the VP of Marketing at Big Panda, Kari Jakay, who will kick off the first section. I want to thank you again for attending and look forward to our conversations in the networking lounge.
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Kari Jakay, and I'm with Big Panda. And like Ryan, I just want to thank you all for being here. This is an important IT Ops community event, and we're looking forward to a great day of sessions. I'm excited to be introducing the first two folks that are part of a fireside chat, but before I do that, I just want to give you a couple of housekeeping tips. The first, if you have any technical issues at all, just click the IT button, the IT help desk button right up there, and you'll get someone on the line to help you right away. If you have any questions during this session or any other, use the Q&A panel and write your questions in, and the speakers will get to them as they close out each session. We also have this year for the first time real-time chat. So during the session, you're welcome to comment, you're welcome to connect with other folks in the session in the chat box. So please feel free to use that. It's another great way to meet people who are also here to learn, share, collaborate. Now I'm going to introduce you to Sanjay Poonen and Asaf Resnick. Sanjay Poonen has had 25 years in the industry as an IT leader, and he was the president at SAP. He was the chief operating officer at VMware. He speaks to thousands of CIOs and their leaders every single year, and his insights are going to be incredible. He is joined by Asaf Resnick, who is the CEO and founder of BigPanda. They are going to be talking about the ways that CIOs think about technology and what's on their minds today. So I'm going to quickly introduce them, and I hope that you enjoy this session and every other one you attend today.
Thank you, Carrie. And Sanjay, thank you again for joining us and sharing of your wisdom and experience.
A pleasure, Asaf. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk today about a few things that CIOs should keep in mind as they go through planning over the next few years. One of the things we wanted to talk about today is kind of cloud and multi-cloud. Big topic.
Yes.
Let's start broadly. If I'm a CIO and I've already been experimenting with cloud, I've put some chips into that pot, and now it's time to go a little bit further into cloud or multi-cloud. What are some of the big issues that I should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think, Asaf, my experience in talking to hundreds and thousands of CIOs was that in this era, especially the last 3 to 5 years, it's all about agility, being able to move much faster, being able to build applications for the purpose of the business, and being able to do that in a very modern fashion, because many of these CIOs, especially every industry now is a tech industry, are hiring engineers who can build apps, or in cases where they can buy apps, they will do that. But you take some of the biggest financial tech customers, fintech customers, or financial customers, some of them are your customers, they're building large applications. So that agility in building applications fast allows them then to be able to say, the best place to do this is preferably cloud native, if you can do that in a new fashion without having to worry about the legacy. Or if you have to maintain applications in a hybrid fashion, you'll have some strategy, a hybrid cloud strategy, and then one or more public clouds. And in the past, 5-10 years ago, it was just, maybe 10 years ago, just one, Amazon, then quickly it was Amazon and Azure, and now in the US is AWS, Azure, and Google.
So, could you just define for the audience, what does that mean, cloud native? And if I'm a CIO and I've got 30, 40 years worth of legacy stuff, how should I be thinking about that journey towards cloud, or is even cloud native a possibility?
It absolutely is. If you've got a legacy application that's, really built with a lot of custom code, most often I hear from CIOs, they are traditionally trying to say, okay, do I try to modernize that application, modernize it on-prem, that's one choice, modernize it and lift and shift it? Do I just let it kind of die and then build a new version of that application over time, cloud native? And the notion of cloud native is using either the services that an AWS, Azure, Google provides you, some of them are their own proprietary services, or open source services that run on that cloud. I personally advise CIOs to definitely move in a way where you're not tethered to one cloud, because the same thing that you saw with the hardware world of 20 years ago, where you could be tethered to one hardware platform or the other, virtualization, a la VMware helped you with some of that, you don't want to be tethered to one. So the open source approach is getting a lot of kind of attractiveness in the public cloud And you have great examples now. Kubernetes is an example of an open source movement, or Elastic, or MongoDB, or many of the, even running Linux in a cloud environment. So all of those approaches give CIOs a flexibility to say, once I've modernized my applications, if I decide I want to move this one day from AWS to Google, I have that ability to do it, and I'm actually building, long-term adaptability into my application architecture.
So just to put a finer point, your point of view is, hey, build on top of open source that can give you the ability to dynamically go from one cloud to another. So you're really avoiding vendor lock into a specific cloud.
Think, applications ought to be timeless, right? I mean, if you're building a timeless architecture you're not building it for 100 years, but at least sort of, say 5 years or 5 to 10 years, you don't want to be a place where if you have to make a change. Now, I don't think CIOs are thinking, oh my gosh, 1 month it's this, another month it's that, 1 quarter it's this. It's usually, if I end up in a place where I need some price flexibility because I don't want to be tethered to one and their prices go up, what would the cost be of moving that application from AWS one day to Google, or so on and so forth, if I do that? So you want to build that level of portability, and open source is one. There's other ways in which you can achieve that. But it's getting a mainstream way by which, I think I'm seeing a lot of CIOs invest in open source technologies that can run in a public cloud. And most of the public cloud vendors have become much, much more. Initially, I think some of them were pushing back on this because they wanted their own proprietary services. But if you look at Azure making big, embrace of Databricks with Spark, and the success of Confluent and Kafka, I could just name a number of these projects that have just been enormously successful. That have open source roots to them, even if some of them have become a little bit more proprietary over time.
Now, talk to me a little bit about how you see, from a HR and people perspective. Typically the traditional on-prem version is you have your storage team, your virtualization team, your networking team, and as you move to the cloud, it's much more of a full stack mentality, which it's a very different ball game, very different skill set. How do you navigate that?
It's a very good question. In fact, it's one of the things that I think a lot of tech teams are wrestling with. I think initially when I look at some of the largest customers I've dealt with, let's take banks, they may have had a private cloud team that had compute, storage, networking, and they'd be investing heavily in VMware or Dell EMC, HPE. And then they'd have a separate team that was focused on Amazon and Azure that were building cloud native services, and those would be a blend of various resources. Sometimes you have the concern that this becomes viewed as the A team versus the B team. People want to go there because that's the way they see the future. I'm starting to see many of those organizations start to blend their skill sets, where you don't want to, where ideally it's one cloud team that's building private and public cloud, with certainly a dispensation towards where the future world is going, a lot more public cloud investments. And then they're really taking a sort of a skill set or a technology stack approach to it. So if you were a networking person in new networking, you want to have an idea of what the old networking world would look like and what the new networking world looks like. Because the domains are very similar. It's just the way in which you're doing that might be very different in a VPN versus a virtual private network versus something else in the past. So I think this is a really exciting time if you're a technologist, and if you're an engineer coming out of college. It's a fantastic time to be looking at the breadth of what both the public clouds can provide you at scale.
So if you're a CIO, your advice to the CIO would be start thinking about how to start merging these teams, or keep them separate but work on lines of connectivity?
I think my first advice would be lean in public cloud first. The world is moving there. You don't want to be like an ostrich with your head in the sand denying that. So number one, build a full awareness of what the latest of AWS and Azure and Google are doing. And you just have to look at the fact that combined three of them are 140 billion in run rate revenue, growing at 43%. So the rest of the world's doing that. If you're not, you're kind of getting left out. I would go public cloud first, private cloud second, and so on. But then once you've decided inside that, based on the applications you're building, it always starts with the applications. What do your business users need, whether it's customer facing, internal facing? Design those applications. I would say in an application use case, go SaaS first if you can. Why build if you can buy it? Why would you want to build a CRM application when you can get it from Salesforce or HubSpot? But if you have custom applications, and 80% of the world is custom applications, build with a modern stack in mind, and open source is one example of that modernization.
So let's touch a little bit on the next topic, which you just brought up, which is kind of application modernization. And I'm thinking about it both from an organizational perspective and a technology perspective. Let's start with organizational perspective. DevOps, SecOps, DevSecOps, a lot of new trends to keep in mind, and they bump up against very traditional kind of software development and operational mentalities. How should a CIO navigate that?
Yeah, I think part of the reason this sort of DevOps or DevSecOps are coming more together is, most of my world was developing products as a developer or running engineering teams at an SAP or VMware, so I understood that world. Yeah. But then when we'd sell those infrastructure that we were building, VMware for example, we were selling to ops teams. And there was often a divide between the ops teams who were maintaining the infrastructure that the apps ran on and the developer teams that were building those applications. The coming together of them, especially in the world of the cloud, means that you can actually have that continuous improvement, continuous development, CI/CD pipeline, really have a much faster approach for building, running, managing, securing all of the full life cycle of a potential application. And I think that that's obviously very evident in the public cloud world. You can go from building to running to managing to securing it all. And I think when you bring that into the world of how a bank or a retailer or a telco or a manufacturer ought to be thinking about that next generation of applications, you get a blending of, again, not just the technology, but now the skill sets. So I think, when you build an organization where DevSecOps is at the center of what you're doing, you have many of these blended skill sets starting to flow into one. Inside engineering teams, you have teams that are a lot more ops savvy. Inside ops teams, you have people who are more developer savvy. Often, if you can bring those together, you get the best. So I'm seeing a lot of this happening in very good ways, even inside ISVs like VMware and SAP, starting to think that way in terms of how they, but much, much more so in the largest customers that we would serve.
Hey, it takes a lot of intentionality, because if I'm a large bank, I've got several decades worth of traditional applications that are built and operate in traditional ways. And those aren't going to be refactored overnight. That's going to be a 10, 15-year journey. And as I'm doing new things, I'm doing it in public cloud and Kubernetes and microservices and CI/CD, the whole cloud native technology stack. And how do you get those two very different kind of modes of operating to work together, and do you even try?
Yeah, if I think about the largest customers that we would serve, in my last 10, 20 years, they were typically in those industries. Banks use that as an example. They typically have anywhere from 4,000, I've seen, to some have over 10,000 applications. And the vast majority of them are custom-built applications opposed to packaged in SAP or Salesforce and so on and so forth. So with the packaged applications, you want to be leaning on the ISVs you deal with. Let's say your largest are SAP and Salesforce or Oracle and Adobe or whatever have you, to making sure that they have opened up as much of their applications through APIs for you to be able to change simple things from the user experience to workflow, all the types of things you would want to that. That's just you working with those vendors, but you're not re-engineering their application. That's their job. They need to expose APIs to you so that you're able to, if you want a different interface or you want ways by which you can move data around, you have that access. But for the custom applications you're building, I saw a number of the largest banks initially being tentative on the public cloud. And, it's all private cloud. And it felt like a little bit of a battle between the private cloud people and the public cloud people, because everyone felt like they could build a cloud infrastructure better than the public clouds. I think the smart banks said, listen, it's not going to be it's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be an and. And it's important for us to develop a skill set. And even if we're making modest investments, we're going to build a team that's initially very steeply focused on what are the best things that AWS Azure are going to be bringing us one by one by one. And then over time, I saw them starting to blend. The natural places, for example, where the folks started to build expertise with AWS were some of the early places where they could do workloads there, dev test workloads there, and then maybe production later on. The best places I saw with Azure were things that were virtual desktop or Office 365 because those were close to Microsoft assets. In Google, it was AI. But then over time, you start to understand these were specializations that these public clouds were strong at. Maybe we need to have not just a purpose-driven architecture for each of those clouds. We need to start bringing those cloud mindsets even to the private cloud team. And I think the most progressive banks, as an example, start to blend those teams under one person, reporting off into the CIO, but had now full multi-cloud responsibility. And the same thing, by the way, at the largest retailers. If you take the largest companies that spend the most on IT and IT development, they're typically banks, retailers, telco, and the public sector governments, especially the civilian and military departments.
Do you see any gaps? If you look at these large telcos, retailers, banks, they have a lot of purchasing power. They can demand things from the large public clouds. Are you seeing any trends that are right now kind of gaps to adoption that those buyers are saying to the cloud vendors, hey, I really want to see 1, 2, and 3 before I go whole hog?
Yeah, listen, it varies, right? If I just to pick a few banks, this is all public, what I'm saying.
Sure.
Capital One was one of the first to go all in on AWS, and probably is one of the big financial services. They could place a lot of demands on what they wanted because they were early in on that and were very vocal in the testimonial. I think Wells Fargo was fairly early in their support of Azure and was doing things with Microsoft. Deutsche Bank, they were public last few years about saying, well, we didn't think, because they were probably a little late to the public cloud, we were going to get the same attention from either of those two, and they went with Google. So I don't think, the good news is when you have three, it's sort of like the car industry, right? Even if you're number 3 in the car industry, you could be a pretty good car. I think BMW is number 3 in the car industry. It's a pretty good car compared to Toyota or Honda, which may be 1 or 2. So I just think that you have to really look at each of these 3 clouds. They're going to be here to stay. They've all got critical mass. On their own, they're huge software industries. And if you're not getting the attention from one, I would make sure if you're a top bank, that you are in the driver's seat, because there's 3 that all want to get your attention, and pick the one that will give you the best intimate customer service and will be a partner of yours for 5 to 10 years to come.
I'm rereading kind of a classic book, Crossing the Chasm.
Good book.
Yeah. It kind of rings true when you were saying, hey, today the cloud industry is mature enough that you have this kind of bifurcation of the cloud vendors and then a layer of all sorts of open source vendors that can give you all sorts of functionality and also help you avoid kind of lock-in. Now, a lot of different choices to go between, lots of vendors giving you lots of capabilities. If I'm a kind of, what is it called, second, mainstream adopter, is there a clear open source cloud tech stack that's starting to emerge that says, hey, this is the safe, proven choice?
Yeah, I think, listen, if you kind of decompose an architecture, the past it used to be like a LAMP stack or a 3-tier architecture. It's very clear that the virtualization layer is commoditized, and it's one of those, EC2, Azure Compute, Google Compute, based on open source technologies. You shouldn't have to deal with that, but they're providing so many different instant types at that layer. At the next layer above that in containers, it's increasingly becoming based on open source technologies, again, Kubernetes based. And if you were using the old containers, whether it was an ECS or the Kubernetes is winning there. And then you go up to the data layer. I'm seeing tremendous amount of adoption of, MySQL-based technologies to Postgres to Spark, even in the midst of some proprietary type technologies like Snowflake that have been successful in there. So MongoDB is another example. So I can go on the data layer. There's so much great technology going on. And if you just look at the number of purpose-driven database technologies that have at their core of it some kind of open source kernel, we can have a whole session just on that. And then of course you get to AI technologies. There's stuff there that's happening, TensorFlow, and then you move all the way up to the UI layer. So I think Asaf, my view is I'm not trying to make this biased so heavily towards open source because there are risks associated with that, and there are often maybe proprietary services from a vendor. But you should bake off the best open source technology that runs on a public cloud against the public cloud native services that are proprietary, because you have to trade off lock-in, which is something that you will have with a proprietary service that only works on AWS, versus open source that's going to be a lot more portable. And if you're finding it's not mature as yet, go with it. And there was a day where the container technology of ECS at AWS was way more mature than what Kubernetes offers, and a lot of the customers went with that. But over time, my general sense is that there is a natural gravitational push because of the number of developers working in open source towards open source technologies prevailing and getting best of breed in that category. So I hope that continues, and that provides buyers for all of your customers and folks who have a tremendous amount of power, but also allows folks like you folks at BigPanda, because you're going to be providing a lot of the infrastructure operations, AI technologies to do AI ops, ML ops, to work in the midst of everything from Prometheus to all the new ways in which people are thinking about doing that. And that brings a tremendous opportunity for folks like you too.
That's why we're here.
Exactly.
That's why we're here. Another question on application modernization around CI/CD. A lot of, if you look at enterprises, CIOs looking at Silicon Valley, seeing, small, agile organizations deploying code, hundreds of times a day. They want to get into those kind of fast release cycles, those high velocity release cycles that introduces a lot of, unintended consequences, lack of visibility, lack of control when you let developers kind of go to town. How's a CIO, how's a large organization to manage that transition? Do they even want to get to that place where a lot of young startups are?
I think that's what you said last is if you ask yourself, Asaf, you're CEO of BigPanda, how do you do releases you have a rhythm to how you're doing that. There's weekly, there's monthly, there's quarterly. There's never, probably 2-year cycles. It's all weekly, monthly, quarterly. Now, a CIO of a large bank may not be able to get to that level of agility that you have as a nimble, fast-growing startup. They may not even be able to get to the agility that we had in a bigger company like VMware. But, I think when you model yourself towards saying, how does even a large company like AWS, if you take the best large company that's producing, I was so amazed whenever I go to reInvent. Yeah. There was just Andy would talk about 150 services they've been working on the last year, or it was 175. And it was like, it just felt like, he would have a 3-hour lecture on every nuance of it. But if a large company like AWS could move fast, that to me is a tremendous inspiration for a large bank or a retailer. And I think that's how the modern CIOs who are thinking increasingly like heads of engineering, of R&D organizations, need to be thinking. I think the best CIOs are folks who understand how software is being developed and model their organization after not just a startup, but the largest company they can find. I used AWS as an example, that's operating like a startup. I like some of those principles that Jeff Bezos talks about, like every day is day one. You just come in with that sort of entrepreneur's mindset to asking yourself, why can't this get done faster? I encourage leaders, not just of CIOs, but engineering organizations, okay, when you get a timeline for something that can be done, ask yourself, can it be cut in half? Can it get half again? There's sort of the same thing that you'd always learn in solving a problem. You split, if you're trying to do a sort algorithm, you split it in half and say, how would it work on half the set and then half the set? I think whenever you try to build that mindset into at some point in time, you don't want to pushing people towards a physical limit of what they can do. But it allows you to question why not? Why can't it be half the time? And I think often people get into this mindset of, this is the mythical man month. All the way back from our engineering of computer science for years, that we're going to finish this thing to some level of perfection as opposed to continuous iteration. And, large companies, whether it's Microsoft building Windows and an Office in the years past to a large bank building a fair amount of, we've all gotten trapped in the mindset because we want to build perfect product and we don't want to make sure that we aren't releasing something sloppy to, if it's a consumer product, to millions and millions of users. But if you look at, again, if I use Google as an example, they're constantly trying stuff, right? Facebook, they're constantly trying stuff. And you're in that mode where it's not sloppy what you release, but you're iterating quickly because you're looking for feedback. That mindset is also something that I think modern CIOs of the large companies are starting to build into their organization culture.
What's a first step to start getting to that kind of culture? Is it, I have to bring a certain type of executive onto my team? I have to, cozy up to some enterprises that have already done this shift and learn from them? What are some pragmatic steps to changing that mindset, changing that culture?
I think in the ones that I've seen at the largest, I use those 3 or 4 or 5 industries that happen to spend the midst of IT, you find leaders in there that, are intellectually curious. They're just naturally, constantly learning. They come to the briefings we would do, and they're just wanting to soak in and ask questions. They're sensing in the room who's the smartest person. They want to stay in touch with them. They're looking for resources they can follow up with. And they're looking for the best companies that allow them to move fast and challenge them. It isn't them acting like in there's this, but they've just got that intellectual curiosity. And I admire, because for me, it was always great to interact with those people because you were teaching each other. You're learning from them, they were learning from you. And that's number one. Now, how do they maintain that when we're not talking to them as a vendor? They're often building that intellectual curiosity into the fabric by teach and learns. All the kinds of things that allow you to celebrate learning and teaching within the organization. And then bringing in mindsets of, you don't want this to make it about just the younger people. Shouldn't be about ageism. Only the younger people move fast and the folks who've been there 20, 30 years can't. The folks who've been there 10, 20 years have tremendous amount of experience. I see a number of folks who might be in their 40s and 50s who move fast, and sometimes the ambitious 20-something who may not be. So you have to balance, the combination of this. But they do get some of the younger, fresh out of school grads who naturally bring some energy and some ambition and challenge them or pair them up with often the folks who have experience.
So let's talk about that. We talked a lot over the last few minutes about kind of top down, how can a CIO have a vision and start bringing that, trickling that down into his organization or her organization. Let's talk about bottom up. I am a director, a senior director. I've got a vision. What's the best way to bring that vision and start, spreading that vision up the food chain in my organization?
I think, as a manager, director, coming up the ranks, the best advice I would give them is the task that you are given to do, do it the best you possibly can so that your area of the product just shines in terms of basic capabilities as low quality of bugs. To me, that's like, hygiene. If you are one where the scrutiny is on and because you've got a high, impact of quality issues, that's a problem. But let's just say everyone plays that, hopefully. I would often find even the large engineering teams, that was one factor. You always were, why is this team always at the forefront of quality issues? But let's just say you've got across that. We're always, I think, as the senior folks, looking at organizations that have got some spark of innovation as you're reviewing what they're doing, where they're going. And that comes from, again, you come back to this intellectual curiosity. I think the great directors are comparing what they're doing to other companies or other groups that are doing the same thing. So if you're at a particular bank and you've got responsibility of director for a particular area, you want to be asking yourself, if you're at JP Morgan, what's Wells Fargo doing? And typically in the banking industry, I notice they talk a lot to each other. And I think that allows you to say, hey, I think what we're doing is genuinely best practice. Now, when you start to hear that, you don't want to be presumptuous because maybe you're not. But if you truly are, you begin to showcase some of those areas that you're and looking for ways by which you can continue to leapfrog.
So we talked about multi-cloud. We talked about application modernization. Let's talk a little bit about AI and automation, which is obviously near and dear to BigPanda's heart. High-level advice to CIOs, how they should be approaching these topics?
I think automation is an easier topic for CIOs to learn about because hopefully they already know a bunch.
Yeah.
And they should be updating themselves on what is the world of operations and automation look like today, especially as it relates to this hybrid cloud or multi-cloud movement. AI is one that I think it's just such a large topic. I just encourage CIOs to be in a learning mindset to understand how AI when used inside applications, because it's typically where that starts, can benefit something about the consumer experience, and where can you start using AI in a very tangible fashion that helps you get a better outcome. And we're seeing all kinds of use cases of that there. And typically, because the public clouds have invested so much in their AI stack, you can often go to them and ask them, what is the best example? Google's probably the one that's gotten the most kind of accolades for what they've built there. What's the best use cases in my industry of where a customer is using your AI technologies to help them get a better ROI? And they usually have got a great compendium because it's often by industry. But I would say, I'm quite frankly, this is an area where, I'm part of the reason I got involved with you guys at BigPanda as an advisor and investor is I wanted to learn more from you guys. So I'm going to turn it back. You've been asking me way too many questions. How is this playing out in what you're talking to your customers about how the state of the AIOps world looks like today?
So I think that it's a question on the minds of a lot of CIOs. How are we using AI to do things better, cheaper, faster? And I think there's emerging kind of two broad approaches. One is using AI as a kind of generic platform to bring on data scientists and use platforms from Google and others to do research for very specific applications, and that's got a lot of use cases. I think where you're seeing even more innovation is packaged AI applications that are very focused on specific use cases and do not require data scientists. So AI for in our case, for incident management, and how do you bring AI to bear and bring a lot of value for automating incident management without having to bring on an army of data scientists? And you're seeing that around a number of applications, both within the office of the CIO, as well as for marketing and sales and customer success. So if I was a CIO, I think the first and foremost question should be, how can I think you said the word tangible, pragmatic. How can I solve business problems using AI applications that don't require a whole retooling of my org chart? And so there's a lot of really good innovation coming out of Silicon Valley around packaged applications to do that. So that would be that's what I see a lot of the best CIOs doing, saying, hey, I don't want to go through data science experiment. I want pragmatic solutions to real world problems. So that's what we're seeing.
And when you see how both you can, as BigPanda, help those customers, what are some of the leading use cases that you're finding customers are able to use BigPanda in a way that's allowing them to get some benefit out of what they're using AI for?
Sure. So the use cases are AI is a driver in our mind of automation, and the use cases for automation is kind of a tale as old as time. And so the use cases are, how do I scale my company, and how do I scale my tech footprint without quadrupling my headcount? That's one. So we've been talking for the last hour around how does the CIO take their business to cloud and cloud native environment, how they modernize their applications, how do they accelerate release cycles. Those are all great things because they let an organization increase their velocity and agility. That's great. On the other hand, it creates orders of magnitude more complexity. You have orders of magnitude more moving parts. Those parts are moving faster, they're scaling faster than ever. And so that's creating this tsunami of data that my operations people cannot keep up with. Turns out that's actually a great application for AI. AI is a generic technology. It's very good at taking large sets of fuzzy and fast-moving data, understanding the patterns in that data, turning that into insight and action. So that's a big one. Is how do I scale? How do I, let's step back. I'm a CIO. I want to go to cloud native. I want to modernize my applications. But if my operations can't go along for the ride, it's a pretty existential bottleneck for the speed at which I can evolve my enterprise. So modernizing my ability for applications to be able to keep the ship running in those new environments. That's a big one. And then at the end of the day, it's not just about intelligent scaling of my team. It's about providing amazing and delightful experiences to my consumers. It's about keeping the lights on, providing the level of SLAs that consumers want, and AI can play, in our role, a very, very important role in that.
When you talk to your customers, where do you see the use of these technologies, AI ops, ML ops, observability, many of these things that are in the budgets of many of the folks who are, in your audience listening in here? Where do you see this all going? They've got many tools that obviously do piece parts of it.
Yeah.
Increasingly, these are becoming platforms. In a multi-cloud world, it's not all going to be done by one cloud vendor.
That's
because
right.
you are playing in the world of multi-cloud. Where do you see this going, and what advice do you give to your customers when you talk to them?
Sure. Look, I think that CIOs today are kind of between a rock and a hard place. The rock is, I want to maintain high availability, and I want to do that as cheaply as possible. And then the other side is, my mandate today is not just to keep the lights on, it's to enable business velocity, enable digital transformation, enable developer velocity. And part of how you do that is adopt a multi-cloud approach. Use the latest and greatest technologies that let me move better, faster, cheaper. Give developer teams the autonomy to choose the tools, the environments, the processes that suit their particular needs so they can run as fast as possible and innovate and provide great things to my consumers. That's all great. The unintended consequences of all that is I've got fragmentation, heterogeneity at scale. What do you do? Well, what you can't do is put the genie back in the bottle and say, hey guys, we're all standardizing on one cloud, one observability vendor, and one tech stack. That's not going to work. That's the opposite of developer velocity. So what you need to do is embrace the fact you're going to have heterogeneity and fragmentation at scale. It's a good thing, but be able to create unified visibility. Develop, be really intentional about creating that connective tissue that says, hey, got a lot of teams moving at the speed of light, doing things differently. That's great, but I can't have it that they're all siloed visibility. They have to have unified visibility across my technology footprint. So you have to invest in those capabilities.
Makes sense. Well, I think it's an exciting world, South, that we live in. And to me, what's been really, really gratifying about this conversation and our dialogue, when I first heard about you guys, this whole topic was in its infancy. And I come from a world that had sort of understood big applications and infrastructure applications, but to find innovation happening at an innovative startup like yourself that's pioneering with customers and pushing the frontier of AI and ML ops, and now building the next generation of where all of this world will go, has been tremendously learning for me, because I think for us, and I would say the same thing to all of your audience listening into it, part of the reason us bigger kind of company folks need to associate with smaller companies, there's a lot more innovation happening in platforms like yourself. So I'm excited to be part of the journey with you.
Sanjay, we're excited to have you as an investor and as an advisor, and thank you for joining us today, and it's always a pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Take care.